Adrian Cole drove a man's face into a walnut table hard enough to crack it in the middle of La Neige Royale's private mezzanine, surrounded by candlelight and frozen river views, 15 seconds after climbing up from the basement dishwashing station. 15 seconds before that, 3 armed men had entered through the service door in formation. Not the formation of delivery men, the formation of soldiers. They had a knife against the throat of the most powerful CEO in Chicago before anyone in the dining room had time to push back their chair. In 11 seconds, 2 men were down and 1 had a broken wrist. In 12, the blade was on the floor. In 13, the man in charge was horizontal across the cracked table, looking at the ceiling, and before he lost consciousness, he said the 4 words that ended 5 years of careful nothing. Arctic 2018, You're Dead. Part 1. The Invisible Man in Winter. The dishwasher at La Neige Royale ran from 9 in the morning until the last plate came back from the dining room, which on a busy Friday was usually close to midnight. Adrian Cole had worked the station for 14 months. Nobody on the kitchen staff called him by his first name. They called him the Quiet One, or sometimes just Cole. And that suited him fine. Chicago in January was a city sealed shut. The lake pulled the temperature down below 0 before noon. Steam rose off the manholes and froze in midair. The pedestrians on Michigan Avenue moved with their heads down, coats pulled tight, focused on the simple project of surviving the next block. Nobody looked at anyone else. That was the part Adrian had learned to love about winter cities. The cold made people invisible to each other, and he had spent 5 years learning how to be invisible. He rinsed a copper saucepan and set it in the drying rack. The kitchen was loud in the way all professional kitchens were loud. Clatter of stainless, the bark of the chef calling tickets, the hiss of butter hitting a hot pan. He worked without thinking, which was the point. His hands moved and his mind stayed quiet. And when the mind stayed quiet, the years before Chicago tended to stay quiet too. He had a daughter. That was the organizing fact of his current life. Emma Cole, age 6, with her mother's brown eyes and his own stubborn habit of asking the same question 3 times before she accepted the answer. She was with Mrs. Alvarez, now his neighbor in the building on West Diversey, a retired school teacher who charged him $60 a week and always had the television turned to the cooking channel when he came to collect Emma at midnight. Mrs. Alvarez never asked where he worked or why he worked nights. She had a grandson in the Navy, and Adrian suspected she understood certain things without needing them explained. Emma had asked him last Tuesday why their apartment had no pictures on the walls. He told her they hadn't found the right pictures yet. She accepted that and went back to her coloring book. 6-year-olds were remarkably pragmatic about the strange particulars of their lives, and for that he was grateful. The snow outside the basement-level windows was a solid white wall tonight. It had started around 4 and showed no signs of stopping. La Neige Royale sat on the north side of the river bend, and from the back kitchen door you could see the frozen surface of the Chicago River 30 feet below, gray and motionless under the falling white. Adrian had stood at that door more than once and looked at the ice and thought about how completely a river could disappear under the right conditions. He was 37 years old. He had once known how to do things that were not rinsing copper saucepans. He did not intend to do any of those things again. His shift ended at 11:30. He had 45 minutes until then. He rinsed another pan. At 8:41 p.m., the service door at the rear of La Neige Royale opened. Adrian noticed because he was standing 6 feet from it, transferring a stack of clean plates to the warming shelf. He noticed because the door should not have opened. The service entrance was coded a 4-digit keypad, changed every Monday, and the delivery window had closed at 6. No deliveries after 6. The sous chef was strict about it. He set the plates on the shelf. The door opened 8 inches and stopped, which was not how doors moved when someone was using them to carry something in. Doors carrying deliveries went all the way open. This door had opened just enough for someone to look through. Adrian turned back to the sink. His hands went through the motions. spray, scrub, rack. He was listening now in a way he had not listened in 5 years, which felt like waking a part of himself he had put under anesthesia. The sensation was not pleasant. 3 people came through the service entrance over the next 40 seconds. He did not look at them directly. He tracked them in the convex security mirror mounted above the receiving station, a precaution against staff theft, the manager had explained when he started. The mirror showed him 3 men in dark coats moving across the concrete floor. They were not carrying anything. They moved in a triangle. Not the triangle of 3 people trying to navigate a corridor together, the instinctive, slightly random shuffling of civilians. This was a formation. Point man forward, 2 behind at staggered angles, each with clear sight lines. Adrian had walked in that formation on 4 continents. He had trained men to walk in that formation. They were not here for the kitchen. The staircase to the mezzanine was at the far end of the corridor, past the dry goods storage. The mezzanine was where La Neige Royale kept its private dining rooms. 3 rooms, booked months in advance, glass walls overlooking the frozen river below. He knew from the reservation sheet pinned above the manager's desk that room B had a party of 9 tonight. He knew from the hostess, who sometimes talked to him the way people talk to furniture, that the party was a corporate dinner. He knew the host was named Victoria Hale. That name meant something. He had avoided letting it mean something for 14 months, because her building was 2 blocks north, and her photograph had been on the front page twice since he arrived in Chicago, and because, in his previous life, he had known enough about powerful people in this city to understand that proximity to them was a form of exposure. The 3 men cleared the corridor and started up the stairs. Adrian set down the saucepan he was holding. Then he heard the scream from the mezzanine, sharp and cut short, like something that had been grabbed and squeezed until it stopped. His hands were already moving. He took the stairs in 4 steps. Room B had glass walls on 2 sides. Through the frosted panels he could see the shapes of people standing, not the relaxed posture of a dinner party, but the rigid, frozen stillness of people who had been told not to move. He hit the door with his shoulder without slowing down. The room was 40 feet long. Oval table, 9 chairs, the remains of a 3rd course. The window behind the table showed the river below, the ice catching the amber light from the riverbank lamps, snow streaking sideways across the glass. 3 men in position, 2 at the corners covering the exits, 1 behind the head of the table with a blade against the throat of the woman seated there. Victoria Hale was 52 years old and built with the kind of stillness that suggested she had been in difficult rooms before. She was not making a sound. Her hands were flat on the table. Her eyes tracked the room with a calm that Adrian recognized as controlled shock, the place the mind goes when the body has decided that panic is not useful. The man with the blade was 6 feet, 180, good balance. The 2 at the corners were lighter, faster looking, and both had their hands inside their coats. Adrian counted the variables in approximately 1 second. It was not a skill he had to think about. It lived below the level of thought, in the part of him that had been awake for the last 60 seconds, while the rest of him pretended to wash dishes. He grabbed a dinner plate from the service cart beside the door and threw it hard at the far corner. It hit the window frame 8 inches from the man on the right, and the man flinched, left a small movement, but enough, and Adrian was already moving across the room, fast, inside the second man's reaction time, under his arm and driving his elbow into the man's sternum with enough force to collapse the diaphragm. The second man went down, making no sound because he couldn't. The man with the blade had started to turn. Adrian caught his wrist, bent it against the joint, and felt the snap that happens when a wrist decides it would rather break than continue resisting. The man made a sound and folded forward, and Adrian brought his face down into the table, the long walnut table that the management had presumably paid a great deal for, with the kind of force that cracked the surface and left the man horizontal and non-functional. The first man, recovered from the distraction, came forward. Adrian picked up the fallen blade, held it reversed, edge out. The man stopped. "On the floor," Adrian said. His voice came out flat and exact, which surprised him slightly. "Both hands where I can see them." The man went to his knees. Slowly. His eyes never left Adrian's face. Adrian looked back at him and saw the recognition there, not the recognition of someone placing a face, but the recognition of a professional encountering someone whose abilities he had miscalculated. They stayed like that for 2 seconds. Then the man on the floor said, very quietly, "Arctic 2018. You were supposed to be dead." Outside, the snow continued to fall, indifferent and complete. Victoria Hale's hands were still flat on the table. She had not moved. "Call the police," Adrian said, to no one in particular, still watching the man on the floor. Someone in the room found a phone. The sirens reached him through the kitchen ceiling at 9:02 p.m. He heard them as he stood at the sink, hands back in the water, washing the last of the dinner service's pans as if nothing had interrupted his evening. He had gone back to the kitchen when the first guests started moving. When the shock receded enough for people to start looking at who had been in the room, he had not wanted to be looked at. The sous chef stood in the doorway and watched him for a long time. Finally, "You should go out the back." Adrian kept washing. "The police will want statements from the dining room staff." "Not from," he paused. "The security cameras in the corridor are on a closed system. The manager controls the footage." Another pause. "He owes me a favor." Adrian turned off the water. He stood for a moment with his hands dripping over the sink, watching the steam drift up from the drain. "Thank you," he said. "Don't come back Monday," the sous chef said, not unkindly. He walked home through the snow. 41 blocks in 60 minutes, which was fine. He needed the time. The cold was precise and total and made the thinking easier. He let himself into the apartment at 10:40. Mrs. Alvarez's television was audible through the wall. He stood in the kitchen without turning on the light. The apartment smelled like the chicken soup Emma had refused to finish at dinner and crayon wax, and the specific cold that accumulated near old windows. He went to Emma's door and opened it quietly. She was asleep on her stomach with one arm hanging off the bed, which was how she always slept. Her breathing was the steady, uncomplicated breathing of someone who had no reason to be alert. He stood in the doorway for a long time. Then he went to the kitchen table and sat down in the dark and said quietly, "Tonight I did the thing I promised I would never do again." He wasn't sure whether the promise had been to Emma or to himself or to the man he had been trying to stop being. For 5 years, it had felt like they were all the same promise. He sat there until Mrs. Alvarez's television went quiet. Then he sat there longer. His phone had no calls on it. That would change. He did not know exactly when, but he knew it would change. The man on the floor of room B had recognized him. That meant someone had sent that man specifically, which meant someone knew that Captain Adrian Mercer, officially deceased since the Arctic operation of 2018, was washing dishes in a basement kitchen in Chicago, under a name taken from a birth certificate filed in a county records office in rural Nebraska. 11 seconds of violence, 5 years of careful nothing, gone. He thought about Emma, about Mrs. Alvarez's $60 a week, about the walk to Emma's school along the Diversey corridor, the way Emma held his hand with her whole fist, the way she insisted on stepping on every crack in the sidewalk in direct defiance of the rhyme. He was still sitting at the table when the phone rang. Not his cell phone. The landline he kept for Emma, because cell phones could be taken, could be lost, could run out of battery at the wrong moment, and the landline would always be there, tied to the wall, a fixed point in a life that had too few of them. He picked it up on the second ring. Captain Mercer. A woman's voice. Controlled, precise, the kind of voice that had spent a long time learning to reveal nothing it didn't choose to reveal. "Or do you prefer, Mr. Cole?" He said nothing. "My name is Victoria Hale. I think we met briefly this evening, under unpleasant circumstances, and I apologize for calling at this hour. I've been in a police interview room for the last 4 hours, and I'm going to be candid with you because I don't have time for anything else." She paused. "I know who you are, the real file, not the death certificate. I accessed what I needed to access and found what I needed to find. And I want you to understand that I have no intention of using any of it unless you choose to do something that makes it necessary." "That's a threat," Adrian said. "It's context," she said. "I have 9 days until a shareholder vote that will determine whether I keep control of my company or whether it passes to someone who will dismantle everything I've built and liquidate the pieces. The men in Room B tonight were not a random event. They were sent by the person contesting that vote. He has resources, and tonight was the first attempt, and I don't believe it will be the last." "Call the police," Adrian said. "I have called the police. They are useful for what happened tonight. They are less useful for what is going to happen between now and the vote." Her voice stayed even. "I'm offering you 9 days of work. In exchange, I will provide you and your daughter with documentation that will survive scrutiny at any level. New identities, complete histories, backstopped through systems that don't make mistakes." Silence. The snow outside the window had stopped. The city sat under it, muffled and still. "How did you know about my daughter?" he said. The question came out flat, which was not how he felt about it. "The same way I know everything I needed to know tonight," she said. "I'm good at this part, the information part. The rest, I need someone who is good at a different part." He looked at the closed door of Emma's room. 9 days. "I'll call you back in 2 hours, he said. "I'll be awake," she said, which he had already assumed. He hung up the phone and went to the kitchen window and looked out at the stopped snow and the orange glow of the city against the clouds. He thought about what it meant that Victoria Hale had known about Emma. He thought about it carefully, from multiple angles. The way he had once been trained to think about threats dispassionately, thoroughly, without letting the part of himself that was afraid interfere with the part that needed to be accurate. Then he called her back in 90 minutes instead of 2 hours, because sitting still had stopped being something he could do. Part 6. The Real Enemy. Charles Hale was 61 years old and had spent 30 of those years believing that Hale Industries belonged to him by a logic that superseded law, sentiment, and the explicit wishes of his brother, who had built it, and his brother's daughter, who had tripled its value. The logic was simple. He had been there first. He had watched it grow from a manufacturing operation in a converted warehouse on the south side into a diversified conglomerate with interests in logistics, medical technology, and green infrastructure. He had watched it grow from a position of moderate seniority and increasing irrelevance, which was a specific kind of watching that had its own consequences for a person's character over 3 decades. He had an office on the 44th floor of a building on Upper Wacker that looked north toward the frozen lake. Floor-to-ceiling windows, furniture chosen to signal expense. He conducted his mornings there, his afternoons in various meetings, and his evenings in a Lincoln Park townhouse, where he kept orchids and a collection of first-edition legal texts he had never read. Victoria told Adrian this during a meeting in her own offices on the morning after the incident. She had a team of 3 security personnel who were competent professionals, whose competence, she explained without self-consciousness, had a specific ceiling. They were trained to manage physical threats in controlled environments. Charles Hale's approach was more architectural. He did not operate at the level of controlled environments. "He will have contracted Victor Cade," she said. She said the name without inflection, which meant she had practiced saying it without inflection, which meant it cost her something. "Cade is not the men from last night. Those were a preliminary measure. Cade is a different category." "You know him," Adrian said. "I know of him. My father knew him in a different capacity, years ago, and parted from him in a way that Cade apparently considered incomplete." She looked out the window at the ice on the lake. Charles would have found that history useful. Adrian had spent the 90 minutes between her calls thinking about 9 days. He had thought about what it meant for Emma and Mrs. Alvarez and the apartment on Diversey. He had thought about the man on the floor of room B and the quality of that recognition, which was not the recognition of someone who had been told to look for a face. It was the recognition of someone who had been there, in 2018, in the Arctic, in whatever had produced a death certificate under his name. That changed the calculation significantly. If Charles Hale had access to people who had been present at the Arctic operation, then running was not a solution. Running moved the problem geographically. It did not end the problem. "I need to see everything you have on Charles," he said. She slid a folder across the table. "I've been building this for 8 months. The folder was thorough. Transfers to an account registered in a name that resolved, through 2 intermediary structures, to a private security contracting firm, incorporated in a jurisdiction that specialized in not being interested in what its registered companies did. The amounts were specific and consistent, the kind of payments that reflected a contracted rate rather than a speculative arrangement. Charles Hale had been funding the operation for 7 months. This was a planned campaign. "He doesn't need to win," Victoria said. "He needs me unable to vote. If I'm incapacitated physically, legally, reputationally, the board defaults to proxy procedures, and his bloc controls the outcome. Then we need 9 days. And we need to give him a reason to believe he's already won, so Cade pulls back until it's too late for a second approach." She looked at him for a moment. "You've done this before. Something like this," he said. Victor Cade called at 3:19 inches the afternoon on the second day. The call came to Adrian's cell phone, which meant Cade had a number that didn't exist in any commercial database. The voice was unhurried. "Emma's wearing the blue coat with the yellow buttons today. She waited at the corner of Diversey and Southport for 11 minutes before the school bus came. She counted the cracks in the sidewalk." Adrian was standing in Victoria Hale's secondary conference room on the 31st floor. The windows looked south. He was very still. "She counted from left to right," Cade continued. "Not right to left. She starts at the curb and works toward the building. She always has. Every morning." He had been cold before. Cold in conditions that made Chicago January feel like summer in mountain passes, on ice fields, in situations where the cold was a tactical problem that required management, or it would kill you. That cold had always been external. This cold was different. He took a breath. "You've made a mistake," he said. His voice came out flat, factual, the voice that did not fluctuate. "Have I? You've told me you're watching her, which means you've told me where you are. You can only watch her from one of 4 positions on that block, and you can only maintain observation without drawing attention if you're in the coffee shop on the west side or the parked vehicle in the loading zone by the pharmacy. Both positions have exit paths that funnel to Southport." "I know Southport." He paused. "You should have called from a harder position." Silence on the line for 3 seconds. "You're going to want to step away from the girl," Adrian said. "Not because I'm asking. Because if you're within 3 blocks of her when I arrive, I will find you in whatever position you're using and remove you from it in a way that doesn't involve any of the authorities currently interested in last night's events." He hung up. He was moving before the phone was in his pocket. 31st floor to ground level in the service elevator, 4 minutes, 45 seconds faster than the standard elevator. He was out the building's loading entrance and running north on Michigan in the cold, code open, covering the 12 blocks to Diversey in 7 minutes. Mrs. Alvarez was there. She had Emma by the hand, and Emma was looking at a pigeon on the fire escape of the building across the street with the focused attention she gave to all animals and most insects. He stopped on the sidewalk. The cold hit him. He was sweating, and the cold hit the sweat, and he stood there for a moment with his hands on his knees, looking at his daughter watching a pigeon. Mrs. Alvarez looked at him over Emma's head. She did not ask questions. "We need to change the plan," he said. She nodded. She had a grandson in the Navy. She understood certain things. He picked Emma up. She was surprised and then not surprised. the way children adapt immediately to new information if it comes from someone they trust. She put her arm around his neck and looked back at the pigeon over his shoulder. "Dad." "It was eating something. I saw," he said. He had not seen. He walked back south with Emma on his hip, scanning the street from habit, from the part of himself that had been asleep for 5 years and was now awake and intended, apparently, to stay that way. He said it out loud for the first time on the morning of the 3rd day, more to hear himself say it than to inform anyone. "I'm not the dishwasher anymore." Victoria was at the window with a coffee she hadn't drunk. Her technical director, a compact woman named Renata Pierce, who wore the expression of someone permanently operating under insufficient sleep, was at the conference table with 2 laptops and a portable server from the company's data security division. "Renata's been building the access architecture for 6 weeks, Victoria said. "She has a path into Charles's corporate communications through a vulnerability in the third-party scheduling software his assistant uses. She can't exploit it remotely without triggering a flag. But if someone installs a specific bridge application onto a device on his network, his phone," Adrian said. "His phone, during a period when it's unattended and within range. His phone is the only device he carries that connects to both his corporate network and his personal accounts simultaneously." She turned from the window. "There's a preliminary board session in 4 days that Charles will attend. It's a closed-door session in this building's boardroom, 9th floor. Phones go into the tray at the door, building security protocol. His phone will be in that tray for approximately 2 hours. Adrian looked at Renata. "What does the bridge application do?" "It creates a passive mirror of his communications during any period when the device connects to his home network or personal hotspot," Renata said. "His financial conversations happen on his personal accounts, not corporate channels. What he's been moving to the contractor account we have traces from the public side. With a mirror of his private communications, we'd have the full architecture." "Enough to take to the board," Adrian said. "Enough to take to a federal prosecutor," Renata said, without changing her expression. "The board would be secondary." Adrian looked at the layout of the 9th floor on the building schematics Renata had pulled from city records. Security desk at the elevator, waiting area, boardroom, a secondary corridor connecting to the building's HVAC system vertically from the basement, an oversight in the original filing that corresponded to a maintenance access passage. He would need to be in position before the board session began. He would need to reach the phone tray from the service access without crossing the security desk's line of sight. He would need approximately 4 minutes with the device. "Have you optimized it?" he said to Renata. 93 seconds, she said. "Including verification." He looked at the schematics for a long time. He thought about Emma, currently at school, currently being watched at discreet distance by 2 of Victoria's security people whom he had briefed himself. He thought about what 4 days meant in terms of exposure. He thought about Arctic 2018 and the man on the floor of room B. He thought about Emma stepping on every crack in the sidewalk. "I need building access documentation that will hold up to a scan," he said. "And I need to walk the service passage tonight." Renata closed one laptop and opened the other. 3 hours, she said. "Let's not waste them," he said. The board session began at 9 in the morning. Adrian was in the service passage on the 9th floor at 8:47. The passage was 18 inches wide, unlit, running parallel to the boardroom's north wall. He had walked it 4 times in the previous 72 hours. He could navigate it without light, which was relevant because the light he'd rigged on the 3rd walkthrough had failed during the 4th. He moved through it now by feel and memory, counting his steps, stopping at the junction point where Renata had marked the position of the junction box, controlling the security camera covering the phone tray. He opened the junction box and then had the camera cycling on a 30-second loop before the first board members arrived at the elevator. The phones went into the tray at 8:59. He watched through a gap in the ventilation panel, a gap he had widened by 2 centimeters on the 3rd walkthrough. 7 phones into the tray, each in its individual silicone sleeve per the building's protocol. He had memorized Charles Hale's phone from photographs. Gray titanium case, distinctive crack running from the upper left corner, an old crack never repaired. Eighth phone into the tray. Gray titanium, crack on the corner. He waited 4 minutes after the boardroom doors closed. Then he moved to the service access point he had prepared on the second walkthrough, a hinged section of the ventilation panel, 2 inches from the floor. He had measured it. It was large enough. He was at the tray in 22 seconds. The bridge application was on a chip the size of his thumbnail, inserted into a port detectable only by a scan specific to that chip format, which Charles Hale had no reason to be running. He held the phone for 93 seconds, watching the screen for the single green indicator. At 89 seconds, he heard a door. Not the boardroom door. The corridor door at the south end. Footsteps. One person, moving toward the security desk. He did not speed up. Speed introduced errors. He watched the screen. At 93 seconds, the indicator went green. He returned the phone to the tray fourth from the left. Same position, same angle, and was back in the service passage before the footsteps reached the desk. He heard 2 sentences exchanged. He did not make out the words. He was already moving back along the passage, counting his steps, heading for the basement mechanical room and the exit route he had mapped on the first walkthrough. He was outside the building at 9:17. At 9:24, his phone showed a text from Renata. Connected. At 9:51, we have the chain. At 10:30, Federal, which meant she had enough to go directly to the U.S. Attorney's Office. The question of the shareholder vote was becoming secondary to a different set of questions entirely, the kind involving federal statutes on wire fraud, conspiracy, and the contracting of private violence against a private individual. He stood on Michigan Avenue in the January cold and looked at the lake, still frozen, still indifferent. He thought about Victor Cade, who had not been visible since the phone call 3 days ago. Cade's absence was not departure. Cade was a professional, and professionals who had been warned did not leave, they repositioned. 3 days until the shareholder vote. He called Victoria. "It's done," he said. "How long until?" "Renata's already moving. The timing is hers now." He paused. "Cade is still in play. I know. I need the next 3 days to be very boring for you." "I can manage boring," she said. She sounded like someone who had not slept in 4 days, which was accurate. "What about you?" He looked at the lake. "I have a daughter to bring home from school," he said. On the last night before the shareholder vote, the storm that the Weather Service had been tracking since Iowa finally reached Chicago. It came in around 8 p.m., the temperature dropping 7 degrees in 40 minutes. The wind off the lake building from manageable to dangerous in the time it took Adrian to walk from the parking structure on Wabash to the building on Diversey, where he had moved Emma 3 days ago. Not their apartment. Mrs. Alvarez's apartment, 2 floors up, which had a second bedroom and a deadbolt he had replaced himself, and which had the additional feature of a fire escape exiting onto the building's rear alley. He had not stayed there. He had stayed in 2 different locations across the 3 days, moving between them on a randomized schedule. This was exhausting, and he was tired in a way that existed below the layer of consciousness, the bone-deep tired that only sustained alertness produces. He let himself in at 8:40. Emma was in the second bedroom, awake, sitting up in bed with her coat folded over the blanket and her boots on the floor beside her. She was holding the book she'd had since she was 4, a battered, illustrated encyclopedia of animals that was missing its back cover. She looked up when he opened the door. "Dad?" Not a question, an acknowledgement. "Hey, Em." Mrs. Alvarez made soup again. "Was it good?" "It was okay." She looked at him with the particular assessment that 6-year-olds applied to adults they had decided required monitoring. "You look tired." "I am tired." She moved over in the bed, which in her understanding of the world was the appropriate response to someone who was tired. He sat on the edge. The storm was hitting the windows now, snow driving sideways past the glass, the street below invisible. "Dad?" she said. "Yeah. Are the bad people going to come?" He looked at the window, at the white nothing beyond it, the storm doing what storms did, which was eliminate the visible world and replace it with itself. He thought about the honest answer, which was, maybe. He thought about Victor Cade and 3 days of silence that were not absence, but patience. He thought about the federal referral in process and Charles Hale made aware by his own attorneys of what was coming. He thought about the shareholder vote in 14 hours. He thought about what it would mean if everything held together and what it would mean if it didn't. He thought about what Emma deserved to hear from him. At 6 years old, in a borrowed bedroom in a storm. "I don't know," he said. "What I know is that I'm going to be right here." She considered this. "Okay," she said. The pragmatism of 6-year-olds. "Can you read the whale part?" He took the animal encyclopedia. The whale section began on page 47, which he knew without looking. He read it in the voice she preferred, not animated, not performative, just steady and even, because steady and even was what the content deserved and also what she found most calming. At 9:20, she was asleep. He put the book on the floor and sat in the chair in the corner of the room, in the dark, listening to the storm. His phone went at 9:43. He answered it in the corridor. "Cade's gone," Victoria said. "Gone how?" "The contractor account Charles's attorneys froze access when they saw what we had. Cade's payment for the second phase cleared last Tuesday, which means he was operating on an advance. Without a functioning client infrastructure, the professional calculus changes." She paused. "He'll surface somewhere. Not here." "Not tonight," Adrian said. "Not tonight." He stood in the corridor and listened to the storm work against the building's exterior. Down the hall, Mrs. Alvarez's television was audible low, some late-night program. The radiator ticked. The wind found the gaps in the window frames and hissed. "The vote is at 10 tomorrow, Victoria said. "I know. Whatever happens, what you did this week, I want you to understand that I understand what it cost." He thought about the dishwashing station in the basement of La Neige Royale, about the copper saucepans and the spray nozzle and the 14 months of practiced invisibility, about the life he had built in the negative space of a death certificate. "It cost what I was willing to spend," he said. "The documentation I promised, it's ready. Whenever you want it." He said nothing for a moment. "We'll talk after the vote," he said. He went back to the chair in Emma's room and sat in the dark. Outside, the storm was everything Chicago reduced to a white roar, the streets buried, the city sealed under it. The man he had been before Arctic 2018 was not gone. He had been waiting in the cold for 5 years, patient and still, conserving whatever it was that such men conserved in the long intervals between necessity. He was awake now. The vote would go the way it would go. Renata's evidence would do what it was built to do. Victor Cade would surface somewhere, in some other winter in some other city. The federal case would take years and produce an outcome that no one could fully predict. These were the variables outside his control. The variable inside his control was the 6-year-old in the bed, breathing the steady breath of someone who had decided, with the complete and uncomplicated logic of childhood, that he was sufficient protection against whatever the world might offer. He intended to justify that decision. He intended to keep justifying it. The storm hammered the windows. He sat in the dark, fully awake, watching the door. In the morning, he and Emma would need to have a conversation about pictures on the walls, about which walls and in which city, and what the pictures would be of. He thought she would have opinions. He was looking forward to that. The winter was not over. The man who had died in the Arctic in 2018 was awake and operational, sitting in a dark room in Chicago listening to a storm. And whatever came next, whatever Cade became, whatever the legal architecture produced, whatever a boardroom decided at 10 in the morning, none of it changed what he was now. He was Emma Cole's father. He was present. Tonight, that was enough. The snow fell. The city disappeared under it, and in a borrowed room 4 floors above a Chicago alley, a man who had once been declared dead kept watch over the one person who made the living worth the effort.